Globally, we now consume 4 billion tonnes of oil every year. Oil spills from shipping accidents and offshore blowouts are rare, but when they happen, the impact on the environment, on livelihoods, and on the local economy can be severe. In this series, we'll be asking the key questions. What issues do we need to consider? What expertise and techniques are available? And how do we deliver a well-planned and executed response to minimise impact?
An oil spill can cause financial loss for a variety of organisations and individuals. In this film, we'll look at how those who are placed at a financial disadvantage may be eligible for compensation.
I'm going to be learning about the economic impacts of oil spills on businesses and livelihoods, and finding out about all aspects of the compensation process, from the sources of recompense to what to do when preparing claims.
Later we'll be meeting some people whose livelihoods were affected by a serious spill, but first I want to find out a little bit more about the legal basis for compensation.
The availability of compensation for damage from oil pollution became a significant issue following the release of oil from the Torrey Canyon in 1967, when there was no mechanism by which costs for damages and cleanup could be recovered. In response, governments, through the International Maritime Organization, developed 2 international conventions. I'm visiting the IMO, a specialised agency of the UN, established in 1948 at a time when the oil trade was expanding. They set the global standards for safety, security and environmental performance of shipping. And with 170 member states, they enjoy truly international backing. The Secretary General is Koji Sekemizu.
Secretary General, when we look at pollution compensation, we know that back in 1967 it was very difficult after the Torrey Canyon disaster for people to get compensation. That's changed over the decades. How influential has the IMO been in those changes?
Torrey Canyon disaster was in many ways a very important event for this organization, for a general maritime community. That disaster actually induced this organization to establish a number of measures, technically as well as legally. The CLC Convention and the 1971 Fund Convention was established by this organization in order to deal with civil liability for pollution compensation.
The Civil Liability Convention and the Fund Convention have established the bedrock for compensation from oil tanker spills in more than 100 countries worldwide. It's a framework unparalleled in any other sphere of pollution compensation.
These conventions seem to work very well. How important are they today for people trying to get compensation?
Without international regime to restrict civil liability, the shipping cannot operate. At the same time, in order to ensure the damage has to be properly compensated, we need to establish international regime for insurance. So those are the mechanisms IMO has established. Without that mechanism, oil industry cannot operate.
Persistent oils, such as crude and fuel oils, do not dissipate quickly and pose a threat to the local environment and economy when spilled. The CLC and Fund Conventions have established a tiered system of compensation for spills of persistent oils, specifically from tankers. The first tier, the Civil Liability Convention, came into force in 1975. It places strict liability on the ship owner for pollution damage up to a maximum of around $130 million, with the liability for each vessel limited according to its size. In the majority of maritime countries, protection and indemnity clubs are the key sources of compensation. There are 13 P&I clubs in the international group, ensuring around 90% of the world's ocean-going shipping.
These P&I clubs are mutual indemnity organisations. They're owned by their shipowner members, they're run by their shipowner members who form the board which make decisions on policy, and they're run solely for the benefit of their shipowner members. They're non-profit making organisations. For the larger claims, up to a higher limit, they share the risk between themselves, they pool the risk. And for the largest claims, and in this context pollution claims, they buy reinsurance from the commercial market. Because the international group of P&I clubs covers most of the shipping industry, they are able to buy such reinsurance in bulk, and therefore they can provide very high levels of cover. Pollution cover is $1 billion per limit, at the lowest possible cost.
Of the 13 P&I clubs in the international group, 8 are based in the UK, 7 of them here in London, 3 in Scandinavia and 1 each in the USA and Japan. Now they'll pay for losses up to the amount set by the applicable convention or national legislation.
For claims to be admissible, there must be a sufficiently close connection between the oil spill and the loss or damage suffered by a claimant. In most cases, claims for compensation should be made to the ship owner or insurer of the vessel. P&I clubs have a network of correspondents based in major ports all around the world. For claims above the tanker owner's liability limit, the Fund Convention came into effect in 1978. It provides a second tier of compensation up to around $300 million in the countries that have signed up. It's administered by the ITOPF Fund Secretariat in London.
Whenever you go to fill your tank of petrol in your car, there will be a tiny small amount of money which will come to us, so that you would be contributing to pay for compensation for damage of an oil spill all over the world, really. 80% of the contributions are funded by 10 countries for the benefit of some 113 countries. That is a great advantage, and that is an instrument of solidarity.
A supplementary fund was initiated after the Erika and Prestige spills by countries that felt the need for additional cover above the Fund Convention. It provides a third tier of compensation up to approximately $1.1 billion. The success of these conventions led to the development of 2 further compensation schemes for other types of pollution. The Bunkers Convention came into force in 2008 and applies to spills of bunker oil used to power vessels from a much wider variety of ships. Compensation under this convention is provided solely by the vessel's P&I club, and ship owners are required to maintain compulsory cover. The Hazardous and Noxious Substances, or HNS Convention, applies to other substances such as chemicals, non-persistent hydrocarbon oil, and vegetable oils carried in bulk and in packaged form. It provides 2 tiers of compensation from vessel owners and receivers in signatory countries. However, this is not yet in force as insufficient countries have signed up. As the conventions work on a principle of strict liability, compensation is relatively simple to access.
Those who have suffered pollution damage do not need to prove the liability of the person who has to pay compensation. And that removes a big hurdle, a big problem that you would face if you are the victim of pollution damage, because you don't need to prove the liability. The ship owner is liable, the fund is liable, and we go there to pay compensation to the victims. So it's a great advantage to the victims that this concept is there.
Although the adoption of these international conventions is widespread, not all maritime countries have ratified them. Some countries have adopted an alternative approach to the conventions and have their own national legislation dedicated to oil spill compensation, such as the Oil Pollution Act, OPA 90 in the USA, which was introduced after the Exxon Valdez spill.
So, from a position in the 1960s when the mechanisms simply weren't in place, there are now several schemes through which victims can claim recompense.
Since the Torrey Canyon, we've learned how to deal with the oil spill, we have a legal framework, we have the money available, we have how to share it. I mean, we've advanced quite a lot in 35 years. So, nobody wants an oil spill, but if an oil spill takes place, we are much more ready now than we were 35 years ago.
When oil spills happen today, the framework is in place to make sure victims can access compensation. The Hebe Spirit spill of 2007 polluted 400 kilometers of Korean coastline and resulted in over 100,000 claims for compensation. Here in Seoul, marine survey firm Komos is still dealing with the aftermath 6 years on. So far, the claims total more than $2.5 billion US. Komos have handled over 30% of these.
저희 회사에서는 모든 인적 자원이 거의 다 여기에 투입됐고요. 그 다음에 또 신규로 많이 또 사람도 보충을 했습니다. 그래서 한 20명을 현장에 사무실을 차려가지고 일을 처리했고.
Irrespective of the expected source of the compensation, the procedure for dealing with claims will normally follow a series of steps. Usually, claims are submitted to the P&I Club or IOPC fund. They are then assessed by surveyors to check the figures and by experts such as ITOPF to review the technical basis of the claims. Getting organised quickly on site is essential.
사고가 발생하면은요. 우선 현장을 많이 보고 또 컴플레인이 들어오는 그곳에는 반드시 가서 사진을 찍고 필요하면 동영상도 찍고 해서 우리가 증거를 나타냅니다. 왜냐하면 방제 작업을 하면 다 증거가 없어지지 않습니까? 그 다음에 이제 그 어느 정도 정돈이 되면은 서류를 작성해서 이제 피해 입은 사람들이 그 선주한테 제출하잖아요. 그러면 그것이 또 우리한테 오면은 우선 그 피해가 사실인가 아닌가 그거를 확인하기 위해서는 과거에 그 우리가 기초조사 그다음에 그 사람들이 주장하는 것이 정말 손실이 정말 현실적으로 있었던가.
In most cases, it's possible to reach an agreement on an amicable basis, but this is a much smoother process if evidence is provided to support the claim.
증거가 뭐 어떤 사람은 종이 한 장짜리도 있고 다양한데 어떤 사람은 추록으로 반추록을 가져온 사람도 있고.
When an incident occurs, a representative or marine surveyor will usually be sent to site. In some jurisdictions, other organisations will be mobilised. On most occasions, when the extent of the pollution merits it, experts, including ITOPF, are appointed to advise on clean-up techniques and on measures to mitigate economic losses.
ITOPF's role in claims assessment really starts from the moment we arrive on site. We're giving advice to all the people responding to the spill on effective response approaches to the government authorities, clean-up contractors and everyone else involved in the clean-up. And we're also meeting with the spill victims to better understand how their livelihoods have been affected. And a key point about our advice is that it's consistent from the moment we're on site to the moment we're in the office.
ITOPF is among a group of organisations that can provide expertise and guidance on issues such as reasonable response measures, the types of evidence required to support a claim, the admissibility of a claim, and the best ways to compile and submit a claim. Well, when a loss is anticipated, notification should be made by the claimant at the earliest opportunity, therefore minimising unnecessary delays in the assessment process. We can often provide this advice while on site.
The aim of the conventions is to place the injured party in a position as close as possible to the one they'd have been in had the spill not occurred. To enable this, 4 primary groups of claims can be submitted.
Firstly, we have compensation for clean-up and preventative measures. That covers the cost of work to recover spilled oil, sunken wrecks, and the cost of protecting sensitive areas. These sorts of operations can involve scores of specialist contractors and equipment. It's critical to establish a means for recording the resulting trail of expenditure as soon as possible.
Following the Hebe Spirit spill, COEM, a Korean national response organisation, claimed compensation for the clean-up activities. This involved nearly 35,000 man-hours of work at just over 50 sites along the west coast of South Korea. These were local people employed by COEM. This initial claim was settled in full at just over $2 million US.
It's a classic example of costs for reasonable and appropriate clean-up by local people being compensated through the international compensation schemes. The next category of claims is compensation for property damage and the costs of cleaning, repairing or replacing oiled property. As a minimum, photographs should be provided before and after restoration to support the claim.
There's also compensation for environmental damage. Work needs to be undertaken to monitor and accelerate natural recovery, and of course, someone needs to pay for that.
Costs should be itemised to explain clearly what work has been done. However, claims based on calculations according to abstract theoretical models for loss of environmental function are inadmissible under the international conventions, though they are recognised under some national legislation regimes.
Finally, we have economic losses, and these can often be the most complicated to assess. There are so many factors that influence economic activity in a local area. So how do you isolate the specific losses from a spill?
To get to grips with some of the issues, I'm going to focus on 2 areas that typically feel the greatest economic impact. That's fisheries and tourism. Tai'an County on South Korea's west coast is famed for clean beaches, crystal clear waters, and really fresh seafood. Park Hee-kwan's family have owned this oyster farm in Shindu-ri for generations. The oysters grow on racks in an intertidal area of the shore and used to represent a large proportion of his income.
판매량은 이제 전국적으로 시판이 되는데 거기서 이제 상인이 2이나 3이 선정돼 갖고 그분들이 매일매일 이제 굴 깐 걸 가져가고 이제 현찰도 지급하고 그렇게 해서 이제 이 기름술 사고 나기 이전에는 참 부유하게 아무런 무리 없이 애들 학교도 가르치고 이렇게 잘 살았었어요.
But all this came to an abrupt halt on the 7th of December 2007. When the Hebe Spirit tanker was struck by a crane barge while at anchor and began shedding nearly 11,000 tons of oil into the sea. It's a day the people of this region will never forget.
완전히 먹통이죠. 까맣죠. 근데 그때 심정은 뭐 일이 어떻다 말할 수가 없었죠. 그런 실정이었죠. 그때는 무슨 심정이고 뭐 말이 안 나오죠. 어떻다요. 자비 캄캄할 정도예요. 신께 대책이 없잖아요.
As the floating oil ebbed and flowed with the tide, oyster farms up and down the coast were contaminated, and Mr. Park's stock was ruined. He received compensation through the schemes in place. However, his farm predated Korean national licensing laws and as such had been permitted to continue operating unlicensed, but he was now prohibited from rebuilding on the same scale and as a result received less compensation than he'd hoped.
그러다 이제 기름 유출 사고 난 이후로 엄청나게 지금 어렵게 생활을 하고 있는 실정입니다.
While cultivated stocks, and particularly shellfish, are vulnerable, wild stocks are generally more resilient. Losses can occur, but can be difficult to differentiate from natural variability in catches year on year, particularly when so many wild stocks are in general decline around the world due to overfishing. So a comprehensive fishery study may be required if widespread impact is suspected. Fishing communities and associated businesses can also suffer from a loss of market confidence after a spill, and this can be difficult to quantify. But it helps when businesses maintain good records from previous years. Another sector which is susceptible to sustaining economic loss during a spill is tourism. Moon Seong-il owns a restaurant in Monsangpo. Tourists were attracted here by the region's reputation for excellent seafood. Business was booming.
1, 2, 3층까지 다 해서 꽉 차가지고 토요일 같은 경우는 약 50명에서 한 100명 정도가 손님을 다 못 받을 정도로 줄 서가지고 기다렸다. 죄송합니다. 옆주고 아직 그 정도로 잘 됐었어요.
Mr. Moon was so confident in how things were going that in 2007 he took out a large loan to expand the business. The spill struck that December.
바다가 오염이 됐다 하면은 수산물한테도 영향이 갈 것이다. 우리 장사하는 사람들까지. 그래서 한 일주일 동안은 사실 잠을 하나도 못 잤습니다. 야, 큰일 났구나, 끝났구나. 그런 막 어떤 아주 절박한 심정이었던 것 같아요. 지금 해당해 보면 그렇습니다.
The restaurant had been fully booked for the holiday period, but as pictures of contaminated coastline began to appear on television, customers began to cancel. Fortunately, the losses that Mr. Moon suffered were covered by the international regime.
보상이라는 자체를 잘 몰랐어요. 그냥 하고 나면 끝나는 줄 알았는데 그 뒤로 이제 정부가 개입하고 현장에 와서 주민들 모여놓고 설명하는 데 있어서 아 이거는 국제기금이라는 보상 기금이 있어서 앞으로 보상 체계로 간다 그래가지고.
Because it was a spill of persistent oil from a tanker in a country that had ratified the CLC and fund conventions, the ship owner was automatically liable, meaning Mr. Moon did not need to engage a lawyer to establish this. He was, however, asked to provide detailed accounts and records of his business in order to file the claim.
제가 봤을 때는 저 개인적으로 보면은 좀 합리적으로 갔다라고 봅니다. 제 성격상 원래 저는 좀 보관을 잘 하는 편이라 그런 부분에 대해서 제가 100% 만족은 못하지만은 일정 부분 피해 배상을 저는 받은 사람 중에 한 사람입니다. 일정 부분 받은 사람인데 그런 자료가 있었기 때문에 가능했었고 거의 대부분은 그런 것 같아요.
To date, Mr. Moon has received around $80,000 in compensation. Though he had hoped for more, he has been able to keep up the payments on his loan and recognises what the scheme aims to achieve.
기금 측이 이제 선주 측 보험회사 성격이지만 실질적으로 이렇게 많은 인력을 투입해서 조사하고 거기에 대한 이제 보상을 해주는 것은 피해민의 권리도 조금은 찾아주자라는 그런 의미 같아요. 근데
Today, Mr. Moon's restaurant is up for sale. Times are tough, but the compensation he received has been critical.
Major spills like the Hebei Spirit can have serious socioeconomic impacts. In this case, the fishing community and people relying on tourism on this coastline were severely affected. There were some widespread impacts on the Korean coast. But fortunately, in this case, the Korean government had signed up to the CLC and Fund Convention, so that provided a system of compensation. It meant that people could get claims settled without the need for legal action. Given the fact that people here were severely affected, their livelihoods were impacted by the spill, I think it was good that there was a dedicated group of people here dealing with their claims. There was a dedicated claims office in Seoul for receiving claims, and there were people that were focused on assessing those claims and ensuring as quick payment as possible.
When it comes to organising claims for compensation, it's to the advantage of most parties to settle quickly. Fortunately, there is now well-established criteria in place. So with good preparation and organisation, the right level of compensation will reach the right people.
And for more details on any of the issues in this series, have a look at the ITOPF technical information papers at itof.com/tips.